She only let an old woman sleep on her couch because no decent person should have to face a freezing night alone. Those were the words people would repeat across the country only days later. But on that bitter December evening, nobody knew the quiet waitress carrying 2 paper grocery bags through a light snowfall would soon become the center of a story that money could never buy. The wind swept through the nearly empty streets of downtown Chicago, rattling holiday decorations that shimmered beneath amber streetlights, while expensive SUVs rolled past without slowing down. Most people hurried toward warmth, their collars raised, their eyes fixed on their own destinations. Emily Carter, 25 years old, finished another exhausting double shift at Maple House Grill, a neighborhood restaurant where she spent every day smiling at strangers who rarely remembered her name. Her red apron was folded neatly inside her backpack, her white work shirt hidden beneath a worn navy coat that had survived 3 winters. Her paycheck barely covered rent for the tiny second-floor apartment she called home, yet she still believed that kindness was something no recession could take away. She had learned that lesson from her late grandmother, who used to tell her that a person's greatest wealth was measured by what they offered when nobody expected anything in return. Emily repeated those words silently whenever life became difficult, and tonight she needed them more than ever. Her landlord had reminded her that rent was due in 3 days. Her refrigerator contained little more than eggs, milk, and leftover soup. Even the old furnace inside her apartment had started making unsettling noises that morning. She had every reason to keep walking, every reason to protect the little she still had. Then she saw the elderly woman sitting alone at a bus stop, wrapped in a threadbare gray coat that looked far too thin for the freezing temperature. Snowflakes rested across the woman's silver hair, while her trembling hands struggled to hold a small paper bag against the relentless wind. People passed by without stopping. Some glanced for only a second before looking away. Others pretended not to notice her at all. Emily slowed her steps. Something about the woman's quiet dignity made it impossible to continue walking. She approached carefully, kneeling just enough to meet the woman's tired eyes. "Ma'am, are you waiting for someone?" she asked gently. The woman offered a polite smile that somehow carried both grace and heartbreak. "I was," she answered softly, "but I think I misunderstood the time." Her voice was calm, but the cold had begun stealing its strength. Emily checked the nearly empty street. No buses arrived. No family members appeared. The temperature continued dropping with every passing minute. She offered the woman her own scarf without hesitation. The woman tried to refuse, but Emily insisted with the same quiet determination she used whenever customers apologized for leaving small tips. "Please," she said with a warm smile. "You need it more than I do." The woman accepted with grateful eyes, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke. The city remained loud around them, yet that simple act of compassion seemed to create a pocket of silence untouched by traffic or winter winds. Emily looked toward the darkening sky and made a decision that common sense might have questioned, but her heart refused to ignore. "I have a small apartment," she said. "It's nothing special, but it's warm. If you're comfortable with it, you're welcome to stay tonight until we figure everything out in the morning." The elderly woman stared at her, surprised not by the invitation itself, but by how naturally it had been offered. In a city filled with millions of people, a waitress who barely had enough for herself had just opened the only door that truly mattered. Neither of them realized that somewhere across the city, one of America's most influential billionaire CEOs had already begun searching for someone who had disappeared without leaving a single clue. Before we continue, if you enjoy unforgettable stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary moments, subscribe to Hidden Tables. Every story reminds us that true character is revealed through courage, compassion, and the choices we make when no one is watching. Now, let's see what happens next. Emily's apartment measured barely 600 square feet, but that night it felt warmer than many of the mansions scattered across Chicago's wealthy suburbs. She unlocked the aging wooden door, apologized for the narrow staircase, and smiled as the elderly woman stepped carefully inside. The apartment was simple, almost modest to a fault. A second-hand sofa rested beside a small bookshelf filled with borrowed library novels. A knitted blanket covered one corner of the couch, and framed photographs of Emily's late grandmother decorated the cream-colored walls. Nothing inside suggested success or luxury, yet everything reflected quiet dignity. Emily immediately turned the thermostat up a few degrees before hurrying into the kitchen. "Please sit down," she said gently. "I will make some hot soup. It is not fancy, but it tastes better than it looks." The older woman smiled with genuine appreciation, slowly removing the borrowed scarf before carefully folding it across her lap, instead of treating it like a temporary kindness. She noticed every detail around the apartment. The carefully repaired dining chair, the handwritten grocery list attached to the refrigerator with a small magnet shaped like a sunflower, the stack of overdue library books beside the window. These were not signs of poverty. They were signs of discipline, resilience, and someone who refused to surrender to difficult circumstances. Emily heated the leftover vegetable soup while placing 2 slices of toasted bread onto chipped ceramic plates. She quietly apologized again. "I usually cook something fresh on weekends, but tonight was a double shift." The woman looked at the meal as though it belonged inside a 5-star restaurant. "This is more than enough," she answered softly. "It has been a very long day." As steam rose from the bowls, conversation slowly replaced silence. Emily learned that the woman introduced herself simply as Eleanor. She never mentioned a last name, nor did Emily ask. Instead, they spoke about ordinary things that somehow carried extraordinary comfort. They discussed winter in Chicago, favorite bookstores, old jazz records, neighborhood bakeries that had disappeared decades ago, and the strange way cities could make millions of people feel lonely at the same time. Eleanor listened carefully whenever Emily spoke, noticing how she never complained about working long hours despite obvious exhaustion. When Emily admitted she had dreamed of studying architecture before family responsibilities changed everything, Eleanor did not offer sympathy. Instead, she asked thoughtful questions, almost as though interviewing someone whose future still mattered. "Do you regret choosing kindness over opportunity?" Eleanor asked quietly. Emily looked down for a moment before smiling. "Sometimes I regret circumstances," she admitted, "but never kindness. If I stop helping people because life becomes difficult, then difficult people have already won." Eleanor lowered her eyes, hiding emotions that almost reached the surface. She had spent decades surrounded by executives who measured success through quarterly reports, acquisitions, and market valuations. Yet this young waitress spoke about character with more conviction than many boardroom leaders she had known. Several miles away, lights remained on throughout the top floor of Walker Global Holdings. Ethan Walker, 42 years old, founder and chief executive officer of one of the largest logistics companies in America, stood before floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. His tailored navy suit remained perfectly pressed despite the late hour, but his composed expression had begun to crack beneath growing concern. His executive assistant approached quietly. "Sir, our security team has checked every location on the itinerary." Mrs. Eleanor Walker left the charity gala after declining her driver. Her phone battery died shortly afterward. Ethan closed his eyes for only a second. His mother had always valued independence, often dismissing extra security whenever she visited the city. Tonight, that independence had turned into silence. "Expand the search radius," he said calmly, though worry lingered beneath every word. "Hospitals, shelters, transit stations, hotels, everywhere. I do not care how much it costs. I just want my mother home safely." Back inside the apartment, Emily spread an extra blanket across the sofa before preparing to sleep in the small bedroom herself. As she switched off the kitchen light, Eleanor looked once more around the quiet apartment and whispered something almost too softly to hear. "The richest home I entered today was not the one with the largest address." Morning arrived quietly, painting soft golden light across the frosted apartment window as the city slowly woke beneath a pale winter sky. Emily was already in the kitchen before sunrise, carefully measuring coffee grounds and warming yesterday's homemade blueberry muffins in the oven. She moved through the tiny apartment with the practiced rhythm of someone accustomed to making the most of every ordinary morning. When Eleanor stepped into the kitchen wrapped in the borrowed blanket, she paused for a moment, watching the young waitress hum softly while arranging breakfast onto 2 mismatched plates. "You really did not have to do all this," Eleanor said with a grateful smile. Emily looked over her shoulder. "Everyone deserves a good breakfast before facing the day," she replied, "especially after sleeping through such a cold night." They sat together at the small wooden table beside the window, sipping hot coffee while watching fresh snow gather across parked cars below. It felt less like two strangers sharing a meal and more like relatives reconnecting after years apart. Eleanor noticed that Emily bowed her head briefly before eating, whispering a quiet prayer of gratitude even though the meal itself was simple. Gratitude before abundance, Eleanor thought. That was becoming increasingly rare. Their conversation drifted toward family. Emily spoke lovingly about her grandmother, who had raised her after her parents passed away years earlier. She explained how her grandmother believed every guest should leave a home feeling more hopeful than when they arrived. She used to tell me that kindness is not expensive, Emily said with a gentle laugh. It only feels expensive when people stop practicing it. Eleanor smiled warmly. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. Emily nodded. She still teaches me every day. Across the city, Ethan Walker had not slept at all. Multiple search teams continued checking hotels, transportation terminals, hospitals, churches, and shelters throughout Chicago. Security footage finally revealed Eleanor leaving the charity gala alone before disappearing several blocks later beyond the range of nearby cameras. Ethan studied every frame repeatedly inside the operations room, while dozens of employees worked through the night. His phone rang. The caller identification displayed the number of an elderly volunteer who coordinated emergency warming centers during severe winter weather. Ethan answered immediately. Mr. Walker, the volunteer began carefully. One of our outreach workers remembers seeing your mother near Lincoln Avenue last night. She was speaking with a young waitress wearing a restaurant uniform before they walked away together. Ethan straightened instantly. Did they mention where they were going? No, sir. But the waitress carried groceries and headed toward the Maple District apartments. Within minutes, security teams narrowed the search to several residential buildings. Meanwhile, inside the apartment, Emily insisted on washing the breakfast dishes before walking Eleanor outside to help locate transportation. Eleanor quietly reached into her coat pocket and discovered her phone had finally regained enough battery power to switch on. Almost immediately, hundreds of missed calls and messages flooded the screen. Emily politely looked away, assuming the notifications belonged to worried family members. Eleanor's expression softened with relief. It seems I have caused quite a bit of concern, she admitted gently. Emily smiled. That just means you are deeply loved. Before Eleanor could answer, another message appeared. It contained only 6 words from Ethan. Please tell me you are safe. Eleanor quickly typed a short reply with trembling fingers. I am safe. I will send my location. Several miles away, Ethan read the message twice before exhaling for what felt like the first time in 12 hours. Without hesitation, he grabbed his overcoat and headed toward the elevator. His assistant hurried after him. Should I notify the media that she has been found? Ethan shook his head. Not yet. First, I want to thank the person who protected my mother when the rest of the city kept walking. Back inside the apartment, Emily helped Eleanor button her coat before carefully wrapping the same borrowed scarf around her neck once again. Neither woman realized that within the next hour, a single knock on this apartment door would quietly change both of their lives forever. Emily had just reached for the apartment door handle when 3 quiet knocks echoed through the hallway. They were calm, measured, almost hesitant, yet something about them carried unusual weight. She glanced toward Eleanor with a puzzled smile. Perhaps your family arrived faster than expected. Eleanor returned the smile, but remained silent. Emily unlocked the door and slowly pulled it open. Standing in the hallway was a tall man wearing a perfectly tailored navy overcoat over an immaculate business suit. Snowflakes rested lightly on his dark brown hair, while a pair of composed blue eyes searched the apartment behind her before finally settling on Eleanor. For one brief second, the confident executive looked nothing like the man featured on magazine covers or financial news broadcasts. He looked simply like a worried son. Mother, he said quietly. Eleanor stepped forward with a gentle smile. Good morning, Ethan. The relief that crossed his face could not have been measured by any market index. He closed the distance in 2 quick steps and embraced her carefully, holding her just long enough to confirm she was truly safe. Emily instinctively stepped backward, giving them privacy, completely unaware that she was watching one of the most recognizable business leaders in America. Ethan finally looked toward her. His expression shifted from relief to sincere gratitude. You must be Emily. She blinked in surprise. Yes, I am. He extended his hand. My name is Ethan Walker. Emily politely shook it without any visible reaction. The name sounded familiar, but after years of serving hundreds of successful professionals at the restaurant, she simply assumed he worked in finance or law. Thank you for taking care of my mother, he said. Our family searched all night. Emily smiled modestly. Anyone would have done the same. Eleanor quietly laughed. No, Emily, they would not. Ethan glanced around the apartment. His attention settled on the folded blanket, the empty soup bowl still drying beside the sink, and the borrowed scarf wrapped neatly around his mother's shoulders. Every detail told the same story. Nothing had been staged. Nothing had been performed for recognition. Everything reflected genuine compassion. He reached into his coat pocket and removed a leather checkbook. Please allow me to repay your kindness. Emily immediately raised a hand. That is really not necessary. Ethan wrote several figures anyway before offering the check across the small entryway. Emily looked down only long enough to realize the amount contained more zeros than she had ever imagined seeing on a single piece of paper. She gently pushed it back toward him. I cannot accept this. Ethan frowned slightly, convinced she had misunderstood. This is not charity. It is gratitude. Emily smiled with quiet confidence. If I accepted money for helping someone who needed warmth, then it would stop being kindness and become a transaction. Silence filled the apartment. Ethan slowly lowered the check. Throughout his career, he had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions, convinced reluctant investors, and persuaded world leaders to support ambitious infrastructure projects. Yet this young waitress had declined an amount of money that could erase every financial burden she carried without raising her voice or showing the slightest hesitation. Eleanor watched her son carefully. She recognized the expression on his face. It was the same look he wore whenever someone challenged one of his deeply held assumptions. Emily, Ethan asked after a thoughtful pause, do you know who I am? She looked at him honestly before shaking her head. Not really. I am sorry. Eleanor smiled warmly. My son happens to lead Walker Global Holdings. Emily's eyes widened slightly. She had seen the company name on delivery trucks across the city and remembered hearing customers discuss its chief executive officer during business lunches. She looked back at Ethan with quiet surprise, but her expression never changed into admiration or excitement. That explains why everyone was worried, she said gently. But it does not change what happened last night. Ethan found himself smiling despite the emotional exhaustion of the previous 12 hours. For perhaps the first time in many years, someone had looked past his wealth, his title, and his influence, seeing only a son grateful to have his mother safely home. After a few moments, Ethan folded the untouched check and slipped it back into his coat pocket without another word. He had spent most of his adult life believing every problem had a financial solution. A delayed shipment required more investment. A struggling division needed better leadership. A charitable cause deserved a larger donation. Yet standing inside Emily's modest apartment, he encountered something money could not purchase. And for perhaps the first time in years, he realized wealth could express gratitude but could never replace character. Eleanor reached for Emily's hands and held them gently. Would you allow me to repay you in another way? She asked warmly. Emily smiled. Knowing you made it home safely is enough for me. Eleanor studied her face for a moment before asking another question. Would you join us for lunch tomorrow? Emily hesitated politely. That is kind of you, but I have a shift at the restaurant. Ethan glanced at his watch. What time? 11 in the morning until 8 in the evening. Ethan nodded thoughtfully, but said nothing more. Before leaving, he looked around the apartment one final time. His eyes paused on the small bookshelf beside the window. Several architecture books rested between novels and cookbooks. Their worn pages suggested they had been opened countless times. You enjoy architecture? He asked casually. Emily looked surprised that he had noticed. Very much. It was my dream when I was younger. What changed? She answered without bitterness. Life needed me somewhere else. Ethan nodded quietly. There was no self-pity in her voice, only acceptance. As he and Eleanor stepped into the hallway, the cold winter air returned, but something inside Ethan had shifted. During the elevator ride downstairs, neither of them spoke until Eleanor finally broke the silence. You are thinking about her. Ethan smiled faintly. I am thinking about how someone with so little managed to make this city feel richer. Eleanor looked out through the elevator glass toward the snowy street below. She never once asked who I was. She never wondered whether helping me would benefit her. She simply saw another human being who was cold. Ethan slowly exhaled. That is becoming rare. Eleanor turned toward her son. No, Ethan. It only seems rare because people like us spend too much time in places where generosity is measured by headlines instead of quiet choices. Those words lingered in Ethan's mind long after they entered the waiting vehicle. The convoy pulled away from the apartment building, but instead of returning directly to headquarters, Ethan asked his driver to take a different route. 20 minutes later, they stopped across the street from Maple House Grill. The restaurant looked ordinary, squeezed between a laundromat and a neighborhood pharmacy. Delivery trucks rolled past while customers came and went carrying steaming coffee cups against the winter wind. Ethan remained inside the vehicle, watching through the tinted window as employees prepared for the lunch rush. "This is where she works?" he asked. His assistant nodded. "According to our information, she has been employed here for almost 4 years. Excellent attendance record. Customers consistently request her section. No complaints." Ethan remained silent. He noticed Emily arriving on foot, carrying the same backpack she had used the night before. She greeted the dishwasher with the same warm smile she had offered his mother. She held the front door open for an elderly customer before disappearing inside, without realizing anyone was watching. There was no audience to impress, no cameras, no expectation of recognition. She behaved exactly the same whether serving strangers or helping someone in need. Ethan quietly understood why. Kindness was not something she performed. It was simply who she was. Inside the restaurant, Emily tied her bright red apron around her waist and greeted her co-workers as another busy day began. None of them knew that across the street, one of the most influential executives in America had canceled an entire morning of board meetings for a reason that had nothing to do with business. He had come searching for answers to a question that no balance sheet had ever been able to explain. What kind of person chooses compassion when nobody is watching? And what could someone like him possibly learn from her? The lunch crowd arrived in steady waves, filling Maple House Grill with the familiar sounds of clinking silverware, quiet conversations, and the comforting aroma of fresh coffee and homemade soup. Emily moved gracefully between tables with the calm confidence of someone who believed every guest deserved the same respect, whether they ordered a cup of coffee or an expensive steak. She remembered regular customers by name, asked about grandchildren, congratulated a young couple on their engagement, and gently helped an older veteran read the daily specials without making him feel embarrassed. To everyone inside the restaurant, she was simply the waitress who somehow made difficult days feel lighter. Across the street, Ethan continued watching from the back seat of his vehicle longer than he intended. Every few minutes he noticed another small act that most people would never remember. Emily quietly refilled an elderly customer's coffee before he realized the cup was empty. She knelt beside a little girl who had accidentally dropped her crayons and helped gather every color without interrupting her smile. When a delivery driver entered carrying heavy boxes, she stepped aside to hold the door despite balancing 3 plates in her own hands. None of those moments generated applause. None earned tips beyond a few extra dollars. Yet together they revealed something Ethan rarely encountered inside boardrooms. Character that remained consistent regardless of who happened to be watching. His assistant finally broke the silence. "Sir, your executive committee has been waiting for 40 minutes. Ethan looked away from the restaurant window. "Reschedule the meeting for this afternoon." The assistant hesitated. "The investors flew in from New York." Ethan answered calmly. "Then they can enjoy lunch in Chicago while they wait." Inside Walker Global Holdings, senior executives exchanged puzzled looks as another calendar notification appeared. Meetings almost never changed because of Ethan Walker. His reputation had been built on discipline so precise that employees joked he could measure time more accurately than the atomic clock. Yet today, every priority seemed different. Back at the restaurant, Emily noticed an elderly man quietly studying the menu with obvious concern. She recognized him immediately. Mr. Henderson had visited every Thursday for nearly 2 years after losing his wife, always ordering the least expensive meal on the menu. Emily approached with her usual warm smile. "Good afternoon. I saved your favorite table by the window." The man smiled gratefully. "You always remember." She laughed softly. "Some people are worth remembering." A few minutes later, she carried out a bowl of homemade chicken noodle soup and a grilled cheese sandwich. Mr. Henderson looked confused. I only ordered the soup. Emily lowered her voice. The kitchen made an extra sandwich today. They did not want it to go to waste. He thanked her sincerely before beginning his meal. Only the cook and Emily knew the truth. There had never been an extra sandwich. She quietly paid for it herself almost every Thursday without mentioning it to anyone. Ethan witnessed the entire exchange through the restaurant window. He turned toward his assistant. Did you see that? She nodded slowly. Yes, sir. Find out whether the restaurant has a community assistance program. 20 minutes later, the assistant returned with surprising news. No, sir. According to the manager, Emily buys meals for certain elderly customers whenever she believes they are struggling financially. She has been doing it for almost 2 years. Ethan remained silent. The realization settled heavily inside him. A waitress earning barely enough to cover rent had quietly fed strangers using her own paycheck, while executives earning 7-figure salaries proudly announced charitable donations only after cameras arrived. He thought back to Emily refusing the check that morning. It had not been an isolated act. It was part of a pattern, a way of living that required quiet sacrifice instead of public recognition. As the afternoon sunlight reflected against the restaurant windows, Ethan finally stepped out of the vehicle. He adjusted his navy overcoat, crossed the snowy sidewalk, and reached for the restaurant door with a simple purpose. This time he was not coming as the chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar company. He was coming as a student, hoping to understand a lesson that success alone had never managed to teach him. The small brass bell above the restaurant door chimed softly as Ethan stepped inside, and for a brief moment nobody paid him much attention. He preferred it that way. Without the towering glass headquarters behind him or a conference room filled with executives, he looked like any other well-dressed businessman stopping for lunch. The hostess greeted him with a friendly smile and offered a table near the front window. Will this be all right, sir? She asked. Ethan nodded politely. It is perfect. Thank you. From across the dining room, Emily noticed another customer had arrived. She picked up a menu and walked over with the same welcoming smile she offered every guest. Good afternoon. Welcome to Maple House Grill. My name is Emily, and I will be taking care of you today. There was not the slightest change in her expression when she recognized him. She did not become nervous. She did not suddenly become overly formal. She simply continued doing her job with the same warmth she had shown everyone else. It is good to see you again, she said naturally. Ethan smiled. It is good to see you too. She handed him a menu. Can I start you with coffee? Only if you are having some yourself later, he answered with a slight grin. Emily laughed softly. I usually wait until the lunch rush slows down. Then I will wait too. As she walked toward the kitchen to place another order, Ethan quietly observed the restaurant from his seat. Employees moved efficiently without panic. Customers smiled more often than they complained. Even during the busiest moments, Emily somehow managed to make every table feel like the only one she was serving. A young father struggled to calm his restless son while trying to finish his meal. Emily quietly brought over a sheet of blank paper and a handful of crayons without being asked. The boy immediately began drawing while his father looked up with grateful relief. At another table, a businesswoman accidentally dropped several documents onto the floor while answering a phone call. Before anyone else reacted, Emily gathered every page, arranged them in order, and wished her a successful meeting. None of those gestures required extraordinary effort. They simply required paying attention to people. When Emily finally returned to Ethan's table with a cup of freshly brewed coffee, he asked, "Does it ever become exhausting caring about everyone?" She considered the question carefully before answering. Some days are harder than others, she admitted. But I learned something from my grandmother. If kindness only appears when life is easy, then it is not really kindness. It is convenience. Ethan stirred his coffee slowly without taking a sip. Do you ever feel people take advantage of that? Emily smiled thoughtfully. Sometimes. But I would rather occasionally help the wrong person than miss the chance to help the right one. Her answer lingered between them long after she walked away to serve another table. Ethan realized she viewed compassion the way he viewed integrity in business. Not as something to negotiate, but as a principle that remained unchanged regardless of circumstances. A few minutes later, the restaurant manager approached Emily with an apologetic expression. One of the evening servers had called in sick, leaving another 8-hour shift uncovered. The manager looked exhausted. I know you already worked yesterday and today, but I honestly do not know who else to ask. Emily glanced toward the crowded dining room before answering quietly. If nobody else can stay, I will help. Are you sure? The manager asked. That would make almost 16 hours this week without a real day off. Emily nodded gently. The customers should not suffer because someone became sick. Ethan overheard every word. He looked toward the restaurant window where snow continued drifting gently across the sidewalk outside. The woman who had opened her home to a stranger after finishing a double shift was now volunteering for another long evening simply because someone else needed help. At that moment, he understood something no financial report had ever revealed. Leadership was not proven by the size of an office or the number of employees reporting to you. Sometimes leadership looked exactly like a tired waitress quietly choosing responsibility over comfort because she believed other people mattered. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories where the most overlooked people reveal the greatest strength, subscribe to Hidden Tables. Here, every story reminds us that courage, integrity, and kindness can come from the most unexpected places. Now, let's see what happened next. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, the restaurant settled into a gentler rhythm. The lunch crowd had faded, replaced by couples escaping the cold and neighborhood regulars who treated Maple House Grill like a second home. Ethan remained at his table far longer than any executive with his schedule normally would, ordering nothing more than another cup of coffee. His assistant had called twice. His board chairman had left 3 messages. Billion-dollar decisions waited downtown, yet somehow none of them felt as urgent as understanding the woman moving quietly between these tables. Emily finally approached with the coffee pot in her hand. You know, she said with a friendly smile, most people finish lunch in about 45 minutes. Ethan chuckled. I suppose I am a difficult customer. Not at all, she replied while refilling his cup. You are probably the easiest customer I have served today. He looked around the dining room before asking, do you ever think about leaving this job? Emily rested the coffee pot against her hip for a moment. Sometimes people ask me that. And what do you tell them? She glanced toward an elderly couple laughing together in the corner booth before answering. I tell them that every job lets you build something. Some people build companies. Some build bridges. Right now, I build moments that help people feel seen. Ethan absorbed every word. He had spent decades building one of the largest logistics networks in North America, connecting cities through highways, rail systems, and distribution centers. Yet Emily measured success through something impossible to place on a spreadsheet. Human connection. Before he could respond, a young busboy hurried toward Emily with obvious concern. The new dishwasher just called. His daughter has a high fever. He cannot come tonight. Emily looked toward the busy kitchen where orders were already beginning to stack up. Without hesitation, she untied her serving apron, handed it to another waitress, and quietly disappeared through the swinging kitchen doors. Curious, Ethan stood just enough to see inside. There she was, rolling up her sleeves beside towering sinks filled with steaming dishes. No complaints. No discussion about whose responsibility it should have been. She simply stepped wherever help was needed. The kitchen staff barely reacted because, to them, this was normal. One of the line cooks noticed Ethan watching and smiled knowingly. She does that all the time, he said while preparing another order. Last month, one of our cooks broke his ankle. Emily learned enough of the prep station to keep dinner service running until we hired someone else. Ethan asked quietly, she learned the kitchen too? The cook laughed. She learned almost everything. Serving tables, baking pies, inventory, scheduling deliveries, even repairing the old espresso machine after watching online videos. Ethan's eyebrows lifted slightly. Has anyone ever offered her a management position? The cook shrugged. She turned it down twice. Said another server needed the raise more because he was raising 2 children. Ethan stood speechless. Hidden behind the bright red apron was someone with abilities no customer would ever notice. She was not simply kind. She was resourceful, observant, dependable, and quietly capable of solving problems wherever they appeared. It reminded him of the most valuable executives inside Walker Global Holdings. Except none of them had ever chosen someone else's promotion over their own. As evening sunlight faded beyond the restaurant windows, Emily emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of fresh desserts as though she had never spent the last hour washing dishes. She noticed Ethan still sitting at his table and smiled apologetically. I hope you were not waiting on me. Ethan returned the smile. Actually, I think I have been waiting to learn something. Emily tilted her head slightly. About business? He slowly shook his head. About people. She laughed softly, believing he was joking, before excusing herself to deliver a slice of apple pie to an elderly widow celebrating her 81st birthday alone. Ethan watched the woman's face brighten with genuine surprise as the entire restaurant quietly wished her a happy birthday. No expensive advertising campaign could have created a stronger sense of community. At that moment, Ethan understood that Emily possessed another gift hidden beneath her humble life. She had an extraordinary ability to notice needs long before anyone else even realized they existed, and that kind of wisdom was far rarer than intelligence alone. The restaurant finally began to quiet as evenings settled over Chicago, leaving only a handful of tables occupied by regular customers lingering over coffee and conversation. Emily wiped down the last empty booth before noticing Ethan still seated by the window, his untouched second cup of coffee now lukewarm. She smiled as she approached with fresh coffee in hand. "I think this one is on the house," she said. "You have officially spent enough time here to qualify as a regular." Ethan laughed, accepting the refill. "Then I suppose I should learn everyone's names." "That would be a good start," Emily replied. Before either of them could continue, the restaurant manager hurried toward the front carrying a thick folder and wearing an expression that revealed equal parts frustration and exhaustion. "Emily, I hate asking this, but could you help me for a minute?" She nodded immediately. "Of course." Ethan watched from a distance as the manager opened several inventory sheets across the front counter. Boxes of produce had arrived that morning, but the delivery records did not match the invoices. Several suppliers had submitted duplicate charges, while others listed products the restaurant had never received. The manager rubbed his forehead. "I have been trying to balance these numbers for 2 hours. If I cannot finish tonight, payroll and next week's orders are going to be delayed." Emily quietly studied every page without speaking. Her eyes moved steadily from invoice to receipt, then back again. She asked only 3 short questions. Did the bakery change vendors this month? Were the frozen vegetables delivered separately? Did anyone enter the dairy shipment twice? The manager blinked. Yes, and I think so." Emily reached for a calculator and began organizing the paperwork into neat stacks. Within minutes, she discovered that 2 invoices shared the same purchase order number, while another delivery had accidentally been entered into the accounting system twice after arriving late the previous evening. She recalculated the totals, circled 3 clerical errors, and slid the corrected figures back across the counter. "Try these numbers instead," she said calmly. The manager entered the revised amounts into the computer. Seconds later, the error message disappeared. His shoulders visibly relaxed. "Emily, this fixes everything." She smiled modestly. It was just entered in the wrong order. Ethan remained perfectly still. He had witnessed financial analysts with advanced degrees spend entire meetings searching for errors far less complicated than the ones Emily had resolved in less than 10 minutes. More surprising was that she never treated the discovery like an achievement. She simply returned to collecting menus as though nothing unusual had happened. The manager called after her. "You really should be running this place." Emily laughed softly without turning around. "I am happy helping wherever I am needed." Ethan found himself remembering the architecture books in her apartment, the way she solved problems in the kitchen, the quiet generosity toward customers, and now this remarkable ability to analyze numbers under pressure. Hidden beneath the red apron was someone whose talents extended far beyond hospitality. She possessed sharp observation, disciplined reasoning, and calm judgment, yet she seemed completely uninterested in proving herself to anyone. After the last customer departed, Ethan rose from his chair and walked toward the counter. "Emily," he said sincerely, "may I ask you one final question?" She nodded. "Of course." He glanced toward the neatly organized paperwork before meeting her eyes again. "How did you learn to solve problems like that?" Emily thought for a moment before answering. "My grandmother used to say every problem tells you exactly how to solve it if you stop trying to impress people and start paying attention instead. So I learned to observe before I react." Ethan smiled quietly. That simple sentence carried more wisdom than many leadership seminars he had attended. As he stepped toward the door, one thought settled firmly in his mind. He had come searching for the woman who had sheltered his mother for a single winter night. Instead, He had discovered someone whose kindness was extraordinary, whose abilities were hidden in plain sight, and whose way of seeing the world might change far more than one family's life. When Ethan stepped outside into the crisp evening air, the city looked exactly as it had the day before, yet nothing about it felt the same. Towering office buildings still reflected the lights of downtown. Traffic still flowed steadily beneath the glowing skyline. People still hurried past one another with destinations that could not wait. But after spending an entire day watching Emily Carter, Ethan no longer believed success could be measured only by numbers. During the drive back to Walker Global Holdings, he remained unusually quiet while his assistant reviewed the postponed agenda. Tomorrow's board meeting has been moved to 9 o'clock. The acquisition team needs your final approval. The international investors have also requested an additional presentation. Ethan listened patiently before asking an unexpected question. How many employees work for Walker Global Holdings across all divisions? His assistant answered immediately. Just over 83,000 worldwide. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. And how many of them have someone who knows their story? The assistant hesitated. I do not know, sir. Neither did Ethan. The realization unsettled him. He had built an organization admired for efficiency, innovation, and financial strength. Yet somewhere along the way, he had become more familiar with quarterly reports than with the people whose daily efforts made those reports possible. Back inside the executive headquarters, senior board members looked relieved as Ethan entered the conference room nearly 2 hours later than originally planned. Charts filled the massive display wall while analysts waited with laptops open and projections prepared. Normally, Ethan would have walked directly to the head of the table and begun discussing revenue forecasts. Instead, he remained standing near the window overlooking the city. Before we begin, he said calmly, I want to ask everyone something. The room fell silent. When was the last time any of us spent an entire day observing one employee whose job title carried no executive authority? Confused glances spread around the table. One director smiled politely. I am not sure I understand the question. Ethan continued. Yesterday, I met someone who earns less in a year than many consultants charge in a week. She solved operational problems without recognition, supported coworkers without complaint, sacrificed opportunities for others, and improved every room she entered. Yet no leadership seminar, no recruiting firm, and no management program ever noticed her. One executive leaned forward curiously. Who is she? Ethan answered simply. Someone who reminded me that talent does not always arrive wearing an expensive suit. The conversation shifted uncomfortably. Financial projections suddenly felt less important than the question hanging over the room. Ethan looked around the polished conference table. Beginning next quarter, I want every executive in this company to spend one full working day each month alongside frontline employees. No media, no announcements, no publicity, just observation and service. A vice president looked surprised. What are we hoping to accomplish? Ethan smiled faintly. Perspective. The room remained quiet because nobody could easily argue against it. After the meeting concluded, Ethan returned to his office overlooking Lake Michigan. Eleanor was already waiting comfortably in one of the leather chairs, reading a novel with a warm cup of tea beside her. She looked up with a knowing smile. You spent the entire day thinking about her. Ethan poured himself a glass of water before sitting across from his mother. I spent the entire day thinking about what kind of company we could become if we hired more people like her. Eleanor closed her book gently. Do you intend to offer her a job? Ethan shook his head slowly. Not yet. She raised an eyebrow. That surprises me. Ethan smiled. If I offer her a position because she helped us, it becomes repayment. I do not want gratitude to cloud judgment. Eleanor nodded approvingly. Then what will you do? Ethan looked out across the glittering skyline where thousands of office lights illuminated the winter night. I am going to discover whether the person she really is matches everything I believe I have seen. Because if it does, she belongs somewhere her gifts can change more than one restaurant. They might change an entire company. 2 days passed before Ethan made another move, but this time he refused to let gratitude influence his judgment. Instead of sending a limousine, an invitation embossed with gold lettering, or a generous financial gift, he asked the Human Resources Division to conduct a completely ordinary review. He requested that Emily Carter be evaluated exactly as any unknown applicant would be. No one outside his executive office was told about the winter night she had protected Eleanor or the conversations inside the restaurant. If Emily truly possessed exceptional character and ability, her own actions would reveal them again without anyone realizing they were being observed. Meanwhile, life continued exactly as it always had for Emily. She woke before sunrise, caught the same city bus, greeted the same neighbors, and tied the same bright red apron around her waist. She never mentioned Ethan Walker to her coworkers because, to her, the story had already ended. She had helped someone who needed warmth, reunited a family, and returned to serving coffee and homemade pie. That was enough. On Friday afternoon, an unfamiliar customer entered Maple House Grill carrying a laptop bag and wearing a plain gray jacket. He introduced himself simply as Michael and requested a quiet table near the back. Unknown to everyone inside the restaurant, Michael was one of Walker Global Holdings' senior talent directors. His instructions were remarkably simple. Observe. Do not interfere. Draw no attention. Emily greeted him exactly as she greeted everyone else. Welcome. I hope you are staying warm today. Michael smiled politely. Trying my best. Throughout the meal, he watched carefully. He noticed Emily memorized every order without writing anything down. She remembered dietary restrictions from previous visits, quietly rearranged seating so an elderly couple could sit closer to the fireplace, and gently calmed a frustrated customer after the kitchen accidentally delayed an order. She never blamed coworkers. She never raised her voice. When another server became overwhelmed during the dinner rush, Emily finished delivering her own meals before immediately helping clear neighboring tables without being asked. Michael wrote only 2 words in his notebook. Natural leader. Near closing time, another unexpected opportunity appeared. The restaurant's payment system suddenly stopped processing credit cards, causing a line of concerned customers to form near the register. The manager looked increasingly anxious while trying unsuccessfully to restart the system. Emily quietly approached the counter and asked one simple question. Did the internet actually fail, or did the payment software freeze? The manager admitted he was not sure. Emily remembered a similar problem months earlier after watching a technical support representative solve it over the phone. She carefully restarted only the payment application instead of the entire computer system, checked the network connection, and manually refreshed the transaction queue. Within less than 2 minutes, the register began working normally again. Applause was unnecessary. Customers simply smiled with relief and continued paying for their meals. Michael wrote another short sentence. Solves problems without seeking recognition. Later that evening, he returned to Walker Global headquarters carrying only a thin notebook. Ethan welcomed him into the office with a single question. Forget everything you know about why I asked you to observe her. If Emily Carter applied for a leadership development program tomorrow, what would you recommend? Michael did not hesitate. I would recruit her immediately. Ethan remained silent, allowing him to continue. She demonstrates emotional intelligence, operational awareness, calm decision-making, initiative, accountability, and unusual influence over both customers and coworkers. The remarkable part is that none of those qualities appear performed. They seem completely authentic. Ethan slowly smiled. It was exactly the answer he hoped for, yet hearing it from someone with no knowledge of the family's connection made it far more meaningful. For the first time since that freezing winter night, he felt completely certain that what he had witnessed was not an extraordinary weekend. It was simply the everyday life of an extraordinary woman whose greatest strength had remained hidden beneath the ordinary title of waitress. The following Monday, Emily received an envelope with the Walker Global Holdings logo printed neatly across the front. She assumed it had been delivered by mistake until she read her own name beneath the company seal. Curious, she opened it during her lunch break in the employee room behind the restaurant. Inside was a formal invitation requesting her presence at the company's downtown headquarters later that week. The letter explained that she had been selected for a leadership assessment and professional conversation. There was no mention of Eleanor, no reference to the freezing winter night, no promises of employment, only an opportunity to attend an interview. Emily read the letter twice before quietly folding it back into the envelope. Her coworkers immediately became excited. Walker Global? That is one of the biggest companies in the country, another server exclaimed. You have to go. Emily smiled politely, but looked uncertain. I have never worked in an office. The restaurant manager overheard the conversation and walked over with a grin. You have already been managing half this restaurant without realizing it. Go see what they have to say. 2 days later, Emily entered the gleaming headquarters wearing the same navy blazer she had purchased years earlier for a community college presentation. It was carefully pressed, though slightly outdated. She carried herself with quiet confidence, not because she believed she belonged among marble floors and glass elevators, but because she believed every person deserved to walk with dignity wherever life placed them. Receptionists greeted her warmly before escorting her to a conference room overlooking Lake Michigan. She expected a panel of recruiters. Instead, Ethan Walker entered alone, carrying nothing except a leather notebook. Emily smiled politely. Good morning. Good morning, Emily. Thank you for coming. There were no intimidating interview questions waiting on the table. Ethan simply invited her to sit. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, he asked, "Why did you accept the invitation?" Emily answered honestly, "Because opportunities should be respected, even if they do not lead anywhere." Ethan nodded. "What if they lead somewhere completely unexpected?" She smiled gently. "Then I will be grateful." Ethan opened his notebook but never looked down at it. "Emily, over the past several days I have learned something important. I thought I was evaluating whether you belonged in our company. Instead, I discovered that our company needs more people who think the way you do." Emily looked surprised but remained silent. Ethan continued, "You solved operational problems without authority. You supported coworkers without expecting credit. You consistently placed people before convenience. Those qualities cannot easily be taught." Emily lowered her eyes modestly. "I was only doing my job." Ethan smiled. "No, you were doing far more than your job." He stood and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "When my mother disappeared that night, hundreds of people passed her without stopping. You welcomed her into your home without knowing her name. Then you refused a reward because you believed kindness should never become a business transaction. That decision forced me to examine my own life more honestly than any business challenge ever has." Emily listened quietly, realizing for the first time how deeply that single evening had affected him. Ethan turned back toward her. "Walker Global is launching a new leadership initiative focused on employee culture, community partnerships, and frontline innovation. I would like to offer you a position as a leadership development associate. You would receive full professional training, mentorship, and the opportunity to continue studying architecture through a company education program if you choose." Emily stared at him in genuine disbelief. It was not the salary or the impressive title that left her speechless. It was the final sentence. "You remembered the architecture books?" she whispered. Ethan smiled warmly. "Leaders pay attention. That is the first lesson you taught me. I simply decided to start practicing it." Emily looked at the offer resting quietly on the polished conference table before lifting her eyes toward Ethan. For several long moments, she said nothing. The silence did not come from doubt. It came from gratitude too deep for immediate words. Finally, she smiled with the same quiet warmth that had greeted thousands of strangers walking through the doors of Maple House Grill. "I would be honored," she said softly, "but only if I can still be the same person I was before I walked into this building." Ethan smiled. "That is exactly why I hope you will say yes. We are not looking for someone to become someone else. We are looking for someone who reminds us who we should have been all along." A few weeks later, Emily's first day at Walker Global Holdings arrived. She entered the headquarters carrying the same notebook she had always used, greeting receptionists, custodians, assistants, and security officers by name whenever she learned it. She never acted as though her title placed her above anyone else. Instead, she spent her first month listening. She visited warehouses, distribution centers, customer service departments, and loading docks. She asked employees what made their jobs difficult and what small changes could improve their daily lives. She wrote everything down. When executives asked about her recommendations, they expected complicated presentations filled with technical language. Instead, Emily spoke about break rooms that needed better lighting, mentoring programs for new employees, scholarship opportunities for workers pursuing night classes, and leadership workshops where managers spent time serving alongside frontline teams instead of simply supervising them. Some executives initially questioned whether such small ideas could truly influence a corporation of more than 80,000 employees. Ethan simply smiled and allowed the programs to begin. Within months, Employee satisfaction increased noticeably. Staff turnover declined. Internal promotion rates improved because experienced workers felt recognized rather than overlooked. Community volunteer participation reached record levels after Emily encouraged departments to serve together outside the office. Customers also noticed the difference. They described Walker Global employees as more welcoming, more responsive, and more connected than before. During the company's annual leadership summit, hundreds of managers gathered inside a ballroom overlooking Lake Michigan. They expected Ethan Walker to deliver another speech about growth, innovation, and future expansion. Instead, he invited Emily onto the stage. She looked surprised as she approached the podium. Ethan stood beside her and addressed the audience with calm sincerity. Several months ago, my mother became stranded on one of the coldest nights of the year. Hundreds of people walked past her. One young waitress invited her into a tiny apartment without asking her name, her profession, or whether helping her would ever be rewarded. That decision changed my family. It also changed me. The room became completely silent. Ethan continued, "We often believe leadership begins when someone receives authority. I learned that real leadership begins much earlier. It begins the moment someone chooses compassion over convenience, responsibility over recognition, and character over personal gain." He turned toward Emily with genuine respect. She never asked for this stage. She earned it long before she ever stepped onto it. The audience rose together in a standing ovation, not because Emily had become an executive, but because they understood the deeper truth behind her journey. She had never stopped being a waitress in the ways that mattered most. She still noticed people others overlooked. She still believed every conversation deserved respect. She still measured success by the lives made better rather than the titles collected. After the applause faded, Eleanor embraced Emily warmly and whispered, "That freezing night, you thought you were saving one elderly woman from the cold. You were actually helping an entire company find its heart again." Emily smiled through grateful eyes. She knew the greatest reward had never been the new position, the education program, or the opportunities now before her. The greatest reward was discovering that kindness, quietly practiced when no one is watching, can travel farther than ambition ever could. Some people inherit influence. Others earn it one compassionate choice at a time. And in the end, the world rarely remembers the richest person in the room. It remembers the one who opened the door when everyone else kept walking. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Hidden Table and join a community that believes true character is revealed not by power or status, but by courage, integrity, and kindness. Thank you for watching. And until next time, we will save you a seat at the hidden tables.